Hello all, this is Piyush. We're going to start a new series that is called as Approach to Mains, that is precisely for history optional. Now when it comes to like this particular series which is called as Approach to Mains, what is the purpose behind it? Look, every area, like whatsoever optional you have been talking about, or let's say like you have been talking about any specific paper of general studies, one thing that you have to understand very carefully, that whenever you have been attempting any question in the mains paper or in the mains examination, you all need to keep in mind couple of things. The moment any question that has been asked, there is a meaning or there is a purpose behind it. There is a sort of concept like which is there. But problem is that this pattern has become very developed, and in fact like this process of answer writing has been made so mechanical that you have been simply said ki, okay, there is a question on this topic, these are the points or these mini points should be there, and in fact in this process what happens, you somehow miss completely the soul of the question, the concept of the question. Look, specifically if I'll talk about history optional, one thing you have to always keep in mind, that the moment you see any question, there is a purpose behind it, there is a concept which is included in the question, and while evaluating the answer, the evaluators always try to find out that whether you have attempted or whether you have targeted that particular concept or the theme which is there inside it, and if you have failed in doing so, in that case you cannot expect very good marks. That is the reason because of what I must tell you that it is very important for you that first of all you should understand that what exactly the evaluator wants to know through that particular question, and the moment you realize that, the moment you understand that, it becomes quite easy for you to write the answer of that particular question. Rather, I'll prefer to say that half of your journey is over the moment you have identified, you have comprehended the real demand of the questions or the real concept of the question. Now, you may ask this question that in history optional there is no concept. It is completely wrong. In history optional itself, specifically in paper 1, I must say that every question which is there, it is actually willing to know something. That is the reason because of what I must say that the questions must be understood with respect to the concept, which is there in the soul of the question, and then only you should try to attempt to write this particular answer. So you have to develop this habit of seeing the questions in this way. In this particular series, what we are going to do, we are going to take various questions as per the themes, and we will try to understand that what theme actually they wanted to know, and that's why this question has been asked. Look, in every individual question you can find different themes are there, and that is the reason because of what we cannot solve it, we cannot understand it just by taking one or two examples, and that's why as I'm telling you that there are different themes, there are different concepts which are there in different questions, and that's how by taking several questions we'll somehow try to understand that how it should be taken. Suppose any question is coming from IBC, so the whole purpose should be very different. Let me tell you very frankly that if any question has been asked on Chalcolithic period, again I should tell you that the whole purpose of that question would be very different. If there is any question being asked on the megalithic culture, again the whole purpose or the concept which is there inside this question, that would be very different, and that's how we will be taking several questions from multiple themes, and then we'll try to decode it rather than just by taking one or two examples, and that's how we have been calling it series, because we are going to take several such sessions in which we'll try to understand that. So in this particular series, I have just taken one question. And what is this question? As you can read, the question is there in front of you. So the question is this: do you agree that archaeological evidence often helps in better understanding of literary sources? Comment. That question was asked in 2019 and the question was of 15 marks, right? So in 2009, and it was a 15-marker question. Now read the question once again. It is not simply asking you to write about archaeological sources, because when you read the content, your basic purpose or the agenda is this, that how come archaeological sources specifically, or let's say precisely, you study about inscriptions or epigraphy does help us in understanding history, or numismatic does help us in understanding history, or let's say literary sources sources do help us in understanding history. So we always read them in a segregated way, right, or in a separated way. But this question has been asked in a very smarter way, and the question is saying ki, do you agree that archaeological evidences, undoubtedly it is talking about the archaeological sources, often helps in the better understanding of the literary sources, right? So basically this question, if I'll decode it, like this question is simply asking that literary sources are not giving the complete picture of any period, and there you can find that the archaeological sources are quite helpful in having a complete picture, right, or a better picture of that period. That is how the question has been asked. So when it comes to this question, there are a couple of things that you have to keep in mind, right? First of all, what is the concept which is there in this particular question? So as I told you that every question you need to understand conceptually that can draft your answer in a better way. So the first thing I'll say in the concept, this is saying that fair understanding of the archaeological sources and the literary sources is very much needed here. Now you have to have a very good idea that what are the areas where precisely the archaeological sources are helping. If I'll keep it in general, in that case I can say that archaeological sources are mostly helping us in answering what, or in writing the history of the material culture of the people. You cannot understand the values, you cannot understand the various ideas in the society. So it helps us simply in understanding the material culture. So what kind of lifestyle they had been leading, what kind of tools they had been using, what kind of settlements they used to have, what kind of clothes they were wearing, right, whether the whether the concept of state was there or not. So basically these are certain things that you can understand with the help of the material sources. But when it comes to the literary sources, now literary sources undoubtedly they tell us about some of the parts of their material culture also, but then you cannot be so sure about the material culture the way you are finding the information through the archaeological sources, because archaeological sources do not tell lie. If in any particular period you find certain archaeological sources, so it had been revealing the material culture as it is. Whether in literary sources, people, those who have composed it or compiled it, they could go to go beyond the time also, and that is the reason because of what we do not know the exact material culture which was there at that point of time. But then at the same point of time we can say when it comes to the ideas, when it comes to the values, when it comes to the virtues, when it comes to the various religious philosophies, right, or the political ideas, or let's say economic ideas, so these kind of things could be understood in a better way through the literary sources. And that's how you should be very clear that actually these are somehow throwing light on two different dimensions of the past, and if that understanding is very clear to you, then only you should go to the next dimension. And what is this next dimension? The most important thing in the next dimension is that word which is the juxtaposition. Now what is juxtaposition? Whenever you study sources which is given in your syllabus, and that too in a very explicit manner, and it is written archaeological sources, literary sources, within the literary sources they have given you so many sub themes also, and that's how you should understand it very carefully. When it comes to writing history on the basis of sources, it is not being written only on the basis of one sources, right? Rather multiple kind of sources have been used for writing it. That is the core of the idea. So basically what is the best way of writing history? You should be very clear that the juxtaposition of the sources are very important. So when you have multiple kind of sources, not necessarily that they all are from one section archaeological or let's say literary. Rather, I should say that when I say juxtaposition, it simply means that you should take the as many as archaeological sources are available and as many as literary sources are available. You should take all of them, you should keep them together, and then only you should try to analyze that what kind of culture or the society you have been talking about. That is the best way. But then it is asking you to prove it with the help of an example that how it can be done. So when it comes to this thing, I'll say something else to you. So basically, I would like to go for an analysis, right? Now what is this analysis? If you have to understand this particular question properly, the core or the crux of this question, in that case you have to go for an analysis. What is it? When it comes to Indian history writing, when it comes to Indian history writing, now the process of this history writing should be very clear to you. As far as this modern history writing is concerned, I am here not counting about this ancient and the medieval one. Rather precisely I have been talking about the modern history writing. Why? Because we believe that once Renaissance and Enlightenment are taking place in Europe, and since then the history writing also had been going through a sort of transformation, and this transformation is even impacting the Indian history writing after the coming of the Europeans into India. So you might have heard about the establishment of Asiatic society and then Orientalist historians and so on. So basically when you will talk about the history writing of India, that too in a modern perspective or in a modern sense, that started in which particular period? That started in the colonial times. So since it started in the colonial times, and like there are certain institutions or the organizations which are helping them in writing this history is like the Asiatic Society and so on. So what was the intention or what was the area of Asiatic Society? It had been translating many Indian classical texts. That was the basic idea. So while doing so, actually they have compiled or they have translated various classical texts of India, and once this translation works were available in some massive form in India, now some of the Orientalist scholars thought of writing the history of India. There comes the problem with the history writing of India. And what is it? Basically, Indian history writing is precisely based upon the literary sources, right? And since India was a colonized region, India was a colony, I hope you can understand that at that, in certain, in this circumstance or in this situation, like the colonial rule must not be investing a lot in the archaeological excavations and the study of the archaeological sources. Though ASI got formed, but then ASI becomes fully functional only after in the first decade of 20th century. Before that, during the period of Cunningham, there was a beginning of ASI, but somehow after the death of Cunningham, it could not continue. And I must tell you that the colonial government, why would they take great amount of interest in developing this ASI and investing money into it? That is the reason because of why the study of archaeological sources could not develop perfectly in India, and that remains one lacuna. After independence, what happens? You can find that in the post-independence era, gradually the ASI becomes more powerful, and in fact it started dealing much with the archaeological sources, right? There was certain development in the area of science also, and that's how the dating of the things, and then putting going for this excavations and all, somehow it became more frequent, more common in India, and that is how the other sort of sources are also gradually available in India. But by that time, since Indian history was being written from the beginning of 19th century, so for last 150 years, or let's say roughly 1.5 centuries, the kind of history was being written in India was precisely based on the literary sources. That's how this becomes a trend in India. And now if we'll understand this core concept and then we'll read the question, then we'll be able to understand how come so many notions which were there, for multiple eras or periods of Indian history that started gradually changing after the coming of the archaeological sources. That is the core idea. So for understanding that question, I think this perception or this concept should be very clear. If you do not have this concept very clear, in that case somehow you won't be able to locate the question properly. That is the core idea. So basically, if we'll see this question once again or read this question once again, in that case you'll find that once the archaeological sources have started coming, so on the basis of that you can find that now a different sort of concepts are being, different sort of history is started coming. Now they have started juxtaposing literary sources along with the archaeological sources, and then sometimes a very different kind of picture was being presented by them. Because the moment you talk about the literary sources, you should also keep in mind, that's very important again I must say, the moment it comes to the literary sources, they are always biased. It is quite obvious that literary sources which were being developed by a particular section of the society, and they had an intention while writing so, or while developing that particular form of literature or that particular kind of literature, and that is how you cannot say that they had been presenting a sort of unbiased or the neutral picture of the society. Rather, through their writings they wanted to present something, they wanted to convey something. That is the core idea. But then you have to understand it, as I told you, with respect to this concept, then only you will be able to write it properly. Okay, fine. Now, if it comes to developing the answer of this question, right, drafting the answer of this particular question, how you should draft it, right? So first of all, this is part 1, I can say. What exactly you are supposed to do in this particular part? So you should define that as far as this Indian history writing is concerned, that is precisely based on the literary sources. Now, what are the USPs of the literary sources. In a very crisp way, maybe in a pointer format, you can write that literary sources are like somehow these are the books, or these are the examples of the literary sources. What are the areas where they are throwing light, right? That is one part. So this is what you will be writing about the literary sources, and then you will be also writing about some of the limitations of the literary sources, that there are certain limitations with the literary sources, and that's how we cannot rely completely on the history which is precisely written on the literary sources. Then you'll be also writing about the archaeological sources, and you'll be also writing that how come the archaeological sources have been giving an alternative picture of the society, an alternative picture of the society. So what are the archaeological sources? What are the USPs of the archaeological sources, and what are the areas which are somehow revealed or conveyed to us properly by archaeological sources? So frankly speaking, in the first question, there are in the first part there are three parts, sub parts in this particular question. Then we'll be going for the second part, and what you are supposed to do in the second part, you need to go for an analysis, right? And what is this analysis? It's very simply that you'll be writing about the limitations. Again, you'll start with this part. When it comes to the Indian history writing, there is a problem with that. It is precisely based on the literary sources, and then you can also write that why is it so much based on the literary sources, and how it is with the coming of the archaeological sources. Now we can say that juxtaposition had started. This is one of the most important keyword which should be there in the answer, how the juxtaposition is being done, and then it had started revealing a very different picture for multiple periods. Now the third part should come up with basically an example. It should come up with an example. Now what is this example? There might be so many examples, but for the sake of example, we can take any one of them, such as I think the post-Mauryan period is very important one, and it can be used for it. The post-Mauryan period. Now what is the significance of post-Mauryan period? If you read the literary sources on the post-Mauryan period, you will find that in this particular period you can this particular period has been conveyed in the literary sources as a period for the Brahmanical revivalism. Why? Because the early study of this period was precisely based on the Brahmanical literature and then Buddhist literature. So at one hand, the Brahmanical literature such as Patanjali and other people's writing, now they have been trying to explain that how come the rulers, those who have been coming, they are patronizers of Brahmanism, and they had been conducting so many rituals, and then so many rituals, and that is how the way you find the social transition is also taking place. The Brahmins are again getting the significance everywhere. We'll find that the rulers were performing all those public rituals which were prescribed to them. So at one hand, this sort of picture you find. On the other hand, if you read the Buddhist literature, in that case it has been shown as a period, as a negative period for the development of Buddhism, and it has been shown all those rulers, they have been coming they hated Buddhism, and in fact they desperately tried to finish Buddhism. This particular concept of Brahmanical revivalism continued for a very long period of time. But once the archaeological sources were excavated, such as you can talk about the various stupas, the chatyas, right, the viharas. Now throughout India you can find that so many such examples are available. And what is irony, what is more surprising, that most of them are being developed in the post-modern period of time, and all those rulers who had been blamed so far for being the supporters of Brahmanism, for frankly speaking, these rulers had been given the credit for constructing or reconstructing those monuments of Buddhism. Now if you'll see the archaeological sources, you find a completely different picture, and that's how you'll be writing how come the juxtaposition of the sources, or let's say how come the archaeological sources somehow give a better idea of the literary sources, or a better understanding of any period which has been so far written on the, or history of this period has been written so far on the basis of the literary sources. That's how you are going to draft this particular answer. So this is how the concept does play a very important role in writing any answer. Now through an example, I just tried to prove it up. So I believe that was quite quite useful for you. Okay. Now coming to the last part. Now on the basis of like this question may be a sort of like an example. There might be several such questions can be drafted. So there were certain sample questions that I have come up with, such as to what extent can archaeological sources, to what extent can archaeology serve as an independent source of history in the absence of like corroborative text, right? Now this is asking a different perspective. To what extent can archaeology serve as an independent source in history, source of history in the absence of corroborative text, right? So it is also somehow based on the similar theme, but slightly the concept is like different here, that you have to understand how there are certain areas that you need to pick up, such as IVC, where you do not have any like literary text, and then how come the archaeological sources become the main sources for writing the history. There's another question: the text speak for the elite, archaeological speaks for the people. Now, very important question, a very interesting question. How come the text speaks for the elite, right? So here you need to write how come the literary sources were mostly manipulated by a particular class. On the other hand, when you talk about the archaeological sources, it actually reveals the culture, the material culture. And since I told you that it doesn't lie, and that is how you get a more like real picture of the period, and that is how it like gives us some insight over the life or the culture of the people at that point of time. This is the core of the idea, right? Then it comes to the third question: literary sources reflect ideology. Again, read it carefully. Literary sources reflect ideology. I think this was the point from where I started this discussion. Archaeological reflects reality, right? So again, it is quite similar to the last one, not exactly similar, but then I think it is very similar to the concept that I started discussing with, so ideology, and then our literary sources somehow more emphasize on the ideology. On the other hand, archaeological sources reflect the reality. So these questions are quite similar questions. I believe that now you'll be in a condition to write the answers of these questions. So that's all about this first session. I believe that this session was useful for you. So keep on following us for next for further such sessions. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.